On this week's episode of the FlipScreen Games podcast, we asked the question, what makes a retro game? What's up, Internet? You're tuned in episode 48 of the FlipScreen Games podcast, a weekly video game podcast where two best buds from different nations come together to discuss the wide world of video games. I'm your host, Pete and Bessie, joined as always by my very good friend and co-host, Mr. Stephen Radford.
Hello, hello.
Hello, Steve. Welcome back.
Yeah, it's good to be back. And it feels like for the first time we've got a solid topic that's not related to like Summer Games Fest and all sorts of stuff kicking off and going on, news craziness. It's nice. I'm looking forward to it. Just a good old-fashioned debate.
I feel like we're kind of getting back in the rhythm with this show, right? Of like the evergreen topics, answering the kids' questions. We did a mailbag episode last week and everything. We got a bunch of more reader mail this week. It feels nice, as much as I love reacting to the news, as much as I love doing the whole, E3 Summer Games Fest season type thing. It's fun, but it's nice to be back to the meat and potatoes. I think, you know what I mean?
Absolutely, yeah. It's also nice to potentially be able to talk about games we're playing. Like, we've not spoken about stuff we've been playing, I swear, for like a month at this point. I've played so many games since we last spoke about it.
So I love that you say potentially too, because that's, I think, the fun thing, right? We've been playing with the format of the show a little bit because we wanted to give more time to the main topics and not have, we have a thumbnail that's about what is retro gaming, and there's 20, 30 minutes of us talking about, whatever games we're playing this week before we get to that stuff. So we've been trying to mess around with it a little bit, and unfortunately, it's just meant that we've talked about the main topic more and not had time to talk about the games we were playing quite as much. So, let us write it and let us know if you missed that conversation at the top of the show. If you want us to play with the format again, we're of course open to your feedback, but it's something we're trying for right now. So, definitely let us know how you feel about that. And we've got a lot to talk about here. Lots of questions from you, the listener. I'd love to get to what we're playing. So, before we do any of that, of course, I have to tell you that this episode of the FlipScreen Games podcast is brought to you by our Patreon producers for the month of July. They are, of course, Christian Oliveria, Christopher Valens, Gabriel Hasselmeyer, a.k.a. Asobi, Mary Berry, Smilky Shake, Wakahula, and Zaid Ida. Thank you all so much for your support over on patreon.com/FlipScreenGames. You are the realest of the real, and we appreciate your support of this fine program. If you want to go and show your support just like they did, head over to patreon.com/FlipScreenGames. You can become a Patreon producer. You can get early access to this and our sister show, Nintendo Noise. You can get exclusive access to our Patreon podcast, One More Thing, where this week we'll be talking about some concerts that I went to and some stuff probably. I don't know. What else will we talk about? Who knows? Sometimes we rank candy bars. Sometimes we talk about video games for an hour. It's really a grab bag, and for you to know what's going to go on, you got to go become a Patreon supporter.
I can't even remember what we spoke about this week. You were talking about shows you were going to go see.
Oh, see, I'm talking about the next episode at this point, right? The one that we're
but the episode that comes out today, as of the time that this goes up.
I don't remember what happened.
What the hell did we talk about?
No idea. I couldn't tell you.
We were talking about bread pudding for a while.
Cool.
And what the hell that was. Yeah.
Ringing endorsement. Go check it out if you want to hear us talk about
it. Was bizarre.
What is bread pudding.
Episode was just like all over the place.
It's a good time. I think it's well worth your investment if you're so inclined. But if you don't have any money for us, that is, of course, no problem. There are a bunch of free ways that you can get involved in the community and support the show. Head over to flipscreen.games where you'll find links to our Discord, where we've got an always growing community of gamers just like you out there playing games together, having a good time. It's a safe, inclusive place for you to come and talk video games, and we hope you'll come and join us and become a part of what we're building over there. Of course, you can follow us on social media. You can write into the show just like everybody did for this week. My challenge to you, whether you're a new listener, whether you're a long time and you've never written in, whether you write in every week, write in for the next week. We've been having a lot of fun with these kind of listener grab bag oriented episodes. So I'd love to keep that trend rolling because it's been fun. So, keep them coming, and we'll keep reading them on the air. So, before we get into our talking point this week on what is retro, I want to try a new segment We're gonna come up with a name for it, and I'll say this too, right? If you want to help us come up with a name, it's gonna be like an icebreaker, right? We'll kind of like just ask a question. Maybe it comes from the audience. Maybe it's something that I was thinking about during the week. Just be a nice little icebreaker before we get into the main topic and what we're playing and all that stuff. So for this week, it's called the icebreaker. By next week, I want somebody to come up with a killer name for this segment, and then you can get the honor of christening the segment yourself. Okay. Think about that. All right, so this one comes from Spring Hill Rick, who wrote in and said, with so many presentations this year in lieu of E3, do you realistically think that it will ever come back?
Do you know, I do, just because of some of the people that were missing from Jeff's show, namely Nintendo, and it seems like they have a really good relationship with the ESA to the point where they just didn't want to show up at Jeff's show this year. I don't know why. Maybe they want to show loyalty or whatever. But I feel like they can coexist if they're in the same place at the same time. And I think we'll see what happens next year if that does go ahead. But I think E3 could come back. I think it needs a lot of changes. It needs to progress and become more digital and follow in some of Jeff's footsteps. But I think it could come back, and I to be honest, I would like to have some level of scheduling and like compact it back down to that week rather than it feeling like it was going on and on forever, and we never know when it's going to end, and like another show gets announced, and we're just like reacting to the show announcements. It's just like shit. We got to quickly figure out when we're going to slot in and watch this so we can talk about it. So yeah, I'd like to see E3 come back. I feel like it's Summer Game Fest almost gets there, but not quite.
Yeah, I would say by and large I agree that I prefer E3 to Summer Games Fest. I think, I definitely think Jeff has done a good job of kind of building Summer Games Fest as it goes, right? The last 2 years at bat. And, it's definitely, I think, grown as a show, and it feels more organized now than it did the first year. And I think, there's every reason to think that it'll continue to improve and get more organized and get more buy-in from some of the big players. Like, we had Xbox and PlayStation supporting Summer Games Fest this year, which I think was definitely a win for what Jeff's trying to do there. But I definitely agree with you that I just think it's not as organized, and I think because it's so spread out, and that you have like a lot of different kind of caliber of events, right? Where like you have, I think like back when E3 was what it was, right? You had like, okay, what's the announcement this year, right? Of the events, and the ESA would come out and be like, this is the order, right? Like, this is when the direct is. We've got Xbox, we've got PlayStation, and like they all kind of had their day and at the time that they went. And then you had whoever else among the kind of more like, mid-tier guys, like your Squares and your Bethesdas and everything, kind of like fitting their own stuff in. And, you had a really clear roadmap of like, for the next, 3 to 4 days, these are the things, this is when they are, like, let's do our predictions, let's do our bets, let's get ready. And, like, I know even, like, when I wasn't necessarily doing, like, commentary on them, right? Like, when I was in college, some of my friends, like, they would get together every single year and, like, plan around watching E3 because it was a regular scheduled event, right? And it was like, akin to having like a Super Bowl party or something like that. But Summer Games Fest, I feel like, is just not like that. And it is so like kind of, oh yeah, like there's 2 events today and they're like in the middle of the day and it's the middle of the week. And, like this one has like, the Xbox one and the PlayStation one were really good and had a lot of really cool announcements and, were like really, really impressive. And like Day of the Devs was really, really good. And then like, there's like the Netflix one and it's like, okay, like this to me doesn't feel as worth it, and like, I think that kind of dichotomy is not ideal, and I agree with you that like I would love to see E3 return to its like former glory, and have something that is like a bit more focused, and have them be competing products that maybe happen at the same time, and just give people more opportunities and everything like that. That would be great. But I kind of don't think it's ever going to do that. Like, to answer Spring Hill Rick's question, do I realistically think it will ever come back? Yes. I think there will be at least one more E3, but I think that there's a really good chance that the next E3 is the last E3, because I don't know that everybody's going to get back and jump right back in line and be like, hey, like, let's pay the ESA an arm and a leg so we can have a booth at this event, when it's like, it's still not super safe to have in-person events. And because of that, a lot of, and this is just, what I've heard through the grapevine and everything, right? Like, because of that, a lot of bigger publishers are no longer developing like demos that are intended to be played at consumer events, because consumer events don't happen the way that they used to anymore. And like that's why like you saw like how many people pulled out of Gamescom that had been at Gamescom every single year, right? And like nobody's going this year. And I think that like all of that contributes to this world where it's like, do we really need E3? And like I want E3, and I think that E3 provides a lot of value historically to the industry, but like with where we're at, it's kind of like it feels as though a lot of companies feel like maybe they've evolved beyond the need for it, and that like
I think a lot of people feel like they've evolved beyond the need for it, especially when you consider Microsoft owns, and once the Activision deal closes, owns a big chunk of the industry at this point. Same with Sony, they've got a lot of studios under their belt. I feel like those two alone, you could have the presentations and have the smaller publishers do their stuff there, and then the bigger ones like the EAs and the Ubisofts would carry on doing their own thing, along with Nintendo. You've then got like 5, 6 presentations rather than the infinite number that we had this year, and it can be more restricted, I think. I don't think that we need as many as we used to, because obviously Bethesda used to have their own thing. Now it's brought in with Microsoft. Presumably Activision will be at the Microsoft event next year if that deal closes as well.
But like to that point though, right? Like why, like Xbox put on their own in-person live E3 style event this year. Why would they pay money to work with the ESA? It just doesn't make sense.
I don't know.
Like, right? Like, and that's the thing is, I think part of it too, right, is companies like Xbox and PlayStation and some of these bigger dogs, you know what they did during the pandemic? And like when all those events went away, they hired departments worth of people to run events for them and do online events and partial live events. And, like, you know what I mean? Like, it's just like, why would you pay the ESA for the right to be a part of their show when you're Xbox Bethesda now, right? Like you could just do whatever you want. Like you send out the invitations to all the same journalists that would have come, and they're gonna show up to your event. It's like, you know what I mean? Like it feels like because it's been gone for so long now, right? It's been like 2, years since we've had a proper E3, and it just feels like everybody has kind of moved on, and like, unless it is like a massive overhaul and the ESA is able to like get people to buy in and prove that like they can still, do something that Jeff can't or that they can't do themselves, I don't see people like, why not just hold your own event and be like, yeah, here, Jeff Keighley, you can call it part of Summer Games Fest and I'll get the same level of attention as I would no matter what. Yeah. Or move out of the summer and do your own thing like in the fall.
And that's where I feel like E3 probably could go. It's like, okay, well, Jeff's stolen summer from us. Let's just move E3 and do it in another time. But then Jeff sort of capitalized on the winter as well, because he's got the Game Awards and everyone seems to prep and do stuff
and it's
for
like,
that.
Do you really expect
and then there's Gamescom
to do like 2 trailers for both of those events too, though, right? Like you have to do 2 separate demos or 2 separate sets. It's like, I just don't think it's going to happen. I think people are going to pick sides and one side's going to win out.
Yeah, I think so too. Or neither wins out and everyone just goes their own way and does their own thing, which I think is also a possibility, because Microsoft didn't use any of the Summer Game Fest branding, but Sony did on their their stream that happened a week before Summer Game Fest, which was very weird as well. And obviously Nintendo wasn't there either. So I think Jeff's got a lot to do to get everyone on his side and get everyone there.
It's still
And
not a
even some of the
proven
smaller,
concept.
like, yeah, and even like the smaller indie ones, for example, I feel like it would have been good if he reached out to like the Wholesome Direct folks and said, we love what you're doing. Do you want to become part of Summer Game Fest proper rather than just being an outlier presentation and actually give it some more eyes? Stream it on the Game Awards YouTube channel, which I also think is really weird that he uses the Game Awards YouTube channel for everything, and he doesn't have like a Summer Game Fest place to go and watch everything. It's really
It's
some of
probably
it's just bizarre.
it's probably
Yeah,
just because like splitting it up is just like not super advantageous. He probably should develop a brand that they
he needs a
both
brand. Yeah, that's
exist
like for both.
underneath.
Yeah.
Yeah, that you
Hmm.
recognize as like, oh, okay, but I guess the Game Awards is that kind of.
Yeah, maybe
I
just
feel
do some
like
more awards in summer as well then.
I
And
feel
not
like
just
yeah, I honestly feel like maybe that's the thing is like you should call it like the Game Awards present Summer Games Fest or some shit like that, right? Like
hmm.
or, I don't know. Maybe he just needs like a Jeff Keighley YouTube channel. But, either way, I am very interested to see if it actually comes back this year. I think if it doesn't come back this year, it's probably not ever coming back. But we'll see what happens, I guess, right? Like brands often get bought and revitalized and could always happen with E3. It's certainly something that I think a lot of people still miss and have nostalgia for and
Yeah.
want it to be a thing again. So I think
Yeah,
that
I
in
could
and of
see
itself
someone
means that there's always the chance.
Yeah, I could see someone like Reed Pop, who are the people that run
Comic Con.
Gamescom and Comic Con. Yeah, I could see them buying the E3 brand and doing it. And obviously Jeff has a relationship with them anyway, so maybe it just becomes that Jeff does the stuff at E3, and the
You just
E3
cut
stuff.
out the ESA, and then Jeff's like, "Oh, I'll come back for E3. That's cool." Like,
Yeah,
yeah, I
I
mean,
feel like it. I feel like if someone bought the E3 branding, Jeff comes back, does it, but it's like managed by a company that actually runs conventions, gets people on board again. I feel like that is when you could possibly see E3 return to its former glory. But otherwise, I agree with you. I think it comes back, but it's nowhere near like what it was, and it's competing with Summer Game Fest because I don't think that's going away anytime soon.
agreed. So thanks for writing in, Spring Hill Rick. We're gonna hear from you a lot this episode, like especially as we move into our talking point for this week, which is what defines a retro game. So this question started brewing on the Discord this past week because Spring Hill Rick wrote in last week on our mailbag episode and asked us a question about adding DLC to a classic game that didn't have DLC. And he actually followed up in the Discord and was kind of like, thought it was funny because we interpreted like what like a classic or like a retro game means a little bit differently than he had intended. So it ended up kind of having this whole conversation in the Discord that spun out from like, where do you draw that line? Like you as an individual. So we thought it would be a fun main topic to jump into and debate a little bit and read some of the comments from folks in the Discord. And, yeah, just as a reminder, right? Come join the Discord. We keep the conversation rolling over there every week. So whatever we talk about on the show, like everybody gets in there and debates and kind of picks apart. And it's a really fun place. And, you should come join it. Come be a part of it. And you can inspire a main topic. Get your stuff right on the air. How cool is that? All right. So the first comment we got here, this one comes from Ciara, a.k.a. Timberwolf. And she wrote in and said, retro is anything older than the PS5. And I'm pretty sure this is just a bit, but also I think that's a very interesting, like, what do you call a last gen console or like library if not retro, right? Like it's no longer modern,
I,
but it's not
especially
retro,
in this
right?
generation, I don't think you can call the last gen retro, considering that's the majority of the games we're still playing. There
Still
have been so
contemporary.
few that yeah, there's been so few current gen exclusive titles. on both the PS5 and on the Xbox that I don't think you can call the last gen retro. Just no way. Absolutely no
How
way in
long
my mind.
into a console generation before that happens though? Like, is it
Well, I
like
think this console generation specifically different just because of issues with manufacturing the units that they need,
it's not
which
that
I think is
different
why we've
though?
had that extent. But we've had a much longer extended cross-gen period.
Have we though? Like we
I
talked
can't
about
remember
this.
the last time that Sony didn't cut off their generations.
They did this with PS3 to PS4.
What did they release? First party titles with it well into the second and going into the third year that was the first party title on PS3 and PS4.
Maybe you're right about
I don't
first
think they did
party.
any
You might
with
be right
first
about first
party.
party.
Third party has always been the way because they
Yeah.
want to maximize as much as possible. But Sony's always wanted to push for you to buy the next console. But the problem is they haven't got a console to sell you at the moment. So they're doing the same thing that the third parties are doing.
I'm trying
Because
to.
I did not think we would get Horizon on PS4.
They
I just
promised
didn't.
it, which I think is probably the only reason they actually did it. They promised that.
Yeah,
for
but
both
like they
that and
didn't
God of
promise
War.
Gran Turismo 7, and we got that there as well. God of War is going back to the PS4 as well, and that's potentially, a late 22, early 23 title.
It's just interesting because the reason I challenged what you said is we talked about this during the PlayStation earnings report episode, where like there are more PlayStation 5s in the wild now than there were PlayStation 4s at the same time in its life cycle. So I don't think it has anything to do with the shortage. I really don't.
Maybe it's them following the competition then, because it looks like a bad, optics or something. Or it could just be
There's
literally that
money
this
on
is
the
the
table.
first time. Or it could be this is the first time it's technically been possible for them because it's the same chip architecture. It's just a newer version of the same architecture.
That's
It's
true.
x86. Whereas previously, we went from the Emotion engine to the Cell architecture, then over to x86. Like the PS3, for example, you still can't play those natively on PS5. If you subscribe to their new service, they're streaming because it's too tricky for them, and they don't want to put the money and the resources into emulating that. But I don't think last gen. I don't think anyone can argue, at least not to me,
Not yet.
that last gen is retro. I don't think so.
I'm trying to figure out what the last crossover title was on PS3.
The last crossover title was probably like Just Dance or
The
something.
Show. MLB The Show. They did that.
Yeah, and that will be because of MLB. That's the only reason it's on. That's the only reason there's a PlayStation Studios game on other consoles.
Little Big Planet 3 was co-released on PS3
Okay.
and PS4. And Helldivers. Resogun.
Okay.
Not too much else.
Yeah, none of the big ones. It's not like,
No.
we're releasing the next Uncharted on PS3 as well as PS4. Yeah, or Killzone.
But see, Horizon
a Gran Turismo.
Yeah, that's the thing though. If you look at the first year or so of the PlayStation 4, there aren't that many big exclusive games anyway.
Yeah, but even something like Knack, for example, right?
Yeah,
why was
Killzone
that
and
not
Knack
launched back
were
on
out
PS3?
on launch year. But the next year, it was Infamous, First Light and Second Son, Little Big Planet 3, which was co-released, and then The Last of Us Remastered, which was a port of an old game. And then 2015 was when you really get into the actual significant big PS5 or PS4 games, I feel like. That's when Bloodborne came out.
And so those ones, if they're releasing this year, because that's 2 years into the lifespan, right? We're going into the third year this year of the PS5's lifespan.
I think that's the thing, though, right? Is I don't think there will be cross-gen releases next year. I really think, unless God of War gets delayed. I think God of War is the last one from Sony.
Yeah.
And I think when you keep that in mind, optically, I think it looks different because the caliber of games that are being cross-released are higher. but it's not actually that many more games when you think about it, right? Because like Demon Souls is PS5 exclusive, Ratchet and Clank is PS5 exclusive. The only major PlayStation published games that have been cross-gen have been Miles Morales and Horizon and God of War. TBD.
And Gran Turismo 7.
And Gran Turismo. So 4, right? Which is like, it's twice as many as PS3 to PS4, but like that's not that, like when it's 2 and 4, that's not that much, right? And you think like Little Big Planet was a really big game at the time, so like that was a pretty significant cross-gen release. Like your point still stands. I think it's just, to me, this reminds me of what the conversation we had around the earnings report, where optically and the narrative is like, oh yeah, like you can't get the PS4 and it's not really out, or the PS5 and it's not really out, and blah 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 blah. But like, it's really not that much different of a situation.
But
than
Sony
the PS4.
do consider it. Sony do consider it to be like a bottleneck for them. It's in their earnings report that they feel like they would have sold more. They would have like. You know, it's the case of at this point in the PS4's lifespan, it was readily available. Anyone can go get it. And they'd sold this many. The PS5 has sold more, but it's not readily available. And we would have sold astronomically more if you could just walk into Best Buy and pick up a PS5 off the shelf.
And like totally, not to discount or disagree with that, but it's just, my point is more like, that's almost irrelevant. That just speaks to the fact that there is more demand for the PS5 than there was demand for the PS4.
Yes.
And like, when you actually,
it's also been sold in more countries
that's
for like
true too.
The first time, right?
Bigger market.
It's much bigger market.
Although the PS4 did that too.
In China.
That cross-released in 14 countries. I think it launched in like within like 2 weeks of each other. But yeah, I mean China's a big market too. So, yeah, it's interesting. So okay, so we're.
Do you consider retro PS4? Do you consider the PS4 to be a retro console?
I'm not willing to confirm or deny where I draw the line yet. So we're gonna keep going. All right, we're gonna keep reading these comments because
okay.
I think each one will inspire the conversation a little bit more, and then you and I will draw the line. Okay, and what I'd like to do is I think we should just draw a line for FlipScreen. Right, like you have your opinion, I have my opinion, and we'll negotiate where the retro line is.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah.
And it'll be.
I think there's 2 lines personally, but that's fine.
Well, when we get to that point, you let me know, okay? All right. So, Chewy, our co-host for Nintendo Noise, wrote in and said, "Wii U is retro, and Mario Kart 8 is my favorite retro game." Now, the Wii U.
It's the last gen console again, so it's 2013 it launched, right?
Yes.
There's no way that's retro.
And that's a weird one, right? But it's like next year it's 10 years old.
Yeah, I don't think 10 years old is enough. I really don't. Like, you don't
think a decade makes a big difference though? Because think about it, right? Like,
a decade in terms of technology used to make a big difference. Now I don't think it does. Like SNES, think about when that launched, and within 5 years, we got the PS1. And the N64.
Okay, but
that was a huge leap, astronomical leap.
But let me ask you this: like, you're right. The jump in technology gets smaller, but think about culture-wise, like how different, like the kinds of games are 10 years removed from each other, right? Like here, I just pulled up the Wikipedia page for 2012 in video games, which is 10 years ago, right? You know what games came out that year? Borderlands
Bioshock.
2, Far Cry 3, Journey, Mass Effect 3, Dishonored, The Walking Dead, the Telltale series, Persona 4.
I gotta say, that doesn't seem that different. Persona's on there, right?
Persona 4 Golden.
Yeah, like, and we're about to get a Persona 4 Golden relaunch next year. It's just like, okay, cool. That to me doesn't seem that different. The biggest culture shift in the last 10 years has been the shift to free to play and the focus on like multiplayer and
but that's what I'm saying.
Microtransactions and things like that.
Number of the games on this list are single player. I don't know. Like this is a different era.
Yeah, but like, when do you consider that like the games people are continually playing the Overwatches, the Destinies, the Fortnites, the Fall Guys. When do you say that they were released? Because they're constantly getting updated, and I don't think you can put those on a list of games released in 2022. But they might be one of the games that people are most like playing most. Like Call of Duty Warzone, for example, is probably going to be the most popular Call of Duty game this year. Didn't come out this year.
But it's contemporary in this, well, because that's a weird thing, though, right? Because, like, I think a great example of that is, like, World of Warcraft, right? Which is one of the highest grossing games of 2012 on this list that I'm looking at. But it was, like, well past its, like, cultural peak, you know? Like, I would say around the original and then Burning Crusade was really when World of Warcraft was, like, its most culturally relevant.
Yeah, it's had like renaissances around some of the bigger expansion packs. But, I would argue that World of Warcraft's been past it for a long, long time. It needs like an overhaul.
But it still makes a lot of
That
money.
would be a game that I would say is ripe for a sequel, not Overwatch. Did you see what they're doing with Overwatch?
No. Stop. Don't get us off. You're about to just pivot us on a whole other thing. Save it for next week.
Yeah. That upset me even more because we had our conversation about Overwatch and then it's just like, yeah, sorry, that one's going away.
So, I don't know. I think it's interesting. It's interesting.
That again is the same argument as the PS3 because next year the PS3 will be 10 years old. Not PS3, PS4 will be 10 years old. And I just don't think that last gen is in any way retro because those games and the game Chewie is like, obviously talking about in jest, Mario Kart 8 is a current gen game. It plays on the Switch. And I think Nintendo is an outlier.
Because then Ocarina of Time is a current
outlier.
gen game. I can play that on the Switch.
Not really. You can't go buy it on a cartridge that's for 60 quid on a shelf from a store.
I can do that with the Mario All-Stars collection, and that's all old games.
Well, you couldn't because they delisted it. But yeah, I get your point.
You could buy it in a store, though.
I don't think last gen is retro. I don't.
Well, we'll see. We'll see. Okay, because I'm glad you brought that up, the 10 years. Asobi wrote in and said, 10 years at least IMO.
Yeah, at least. Way more than that, though, I think.
Way more, now you're saying.
Yeah. 10 years is nowhere near enough.
Interesting. Okay, well, we'll dig in on that.
Yeah. I mean, there's several ways you can count the line. Like, do you count it in years? Do you count it in, like, technology that's being used? Do you count it in, like, console generations?
That's what we're going to have to find out.
It's, like, 2 generations back or, like, 10 years back.
That's what we're going to have to get to the bottom of.
Because if you get there, like, in, say, 5 years' time, 10 years is slap bang in the middle of like, the PS4 era. I don't.
10 years ago?
In 7 years. In 7 years' time. No, 5 years' time. That'll be really coming up to the end of, like, this era if we were doing it based on 7-year cycles again.
Mm-hmm.
That takes you back towards the end of like, the PS4 era and the generation going into the cross-gen titles that we experience. I don't think that we're going to consider that retro.
Oh, I feel like we will at that point. I think
What,
you're.
you think
you're
the
biased
early
because of your
PS5
age.
titles?
Like, you're saying PS5
titles in 5? Yeah, in 5 years' time, like towards the end of this generation, when we're into the next generation, do you feel like we're going to think that early PS5 titles are retro? I don't
I see
think
what you're
we will.
saying. I see what you're saying. Okay, I misinterpreted. I thought you were saying that we wouldn't think PS4 titles were retro at that point. I'm like, oh, surely they must be. 2 generations later, that would be insane to say that it's not.
No,
retro
like
at
early
that point.
PS5. Like if you're saying it's just because like we're just into this generation and we're saying last gen titles are retro, you really think we're going to start thinking PS5 games are retro?
I gotta tell you, man, I don't know. I think 5 years is definitely too short, but 10 years to me feels closer to correct because I'm thinking about like where I was in my life and what kind of games I was playing 10 years ago, and it's very different, right? Like 10 years ago, right now, we're at the end of the Xbox 360, PlayStation 3 generation. That to me feels like a really long time ago now. And like I was in
Yeah,
college.
but
I was barely
next year,
fucking able to drink. Now I'm like approaching 30 and getting married and buying a house and like
there's no way. There is
me,
no
like,
way. Do you know
that's a huge
next year?
change.
If we're going based on next year, right? 10 years, we're saying
Maybe
we're making Grand Theft Auto 5 a retro game.
I don't. Yeah, but you only feel that way about that game because
Because people are still playing it.
that doesn't mean that doesn't mean anything though. People are still playing all kinds of old ass games.
Yeah, but
People
the
still play
titles on these
StarCraft.
lists.
Does that mean
title
StarCraft
of the,
isn't
like-
retro? People still play World of Warcraft. That came out in what, 2005?
What about League
4?
of Legends? Do you think that one is retro?
That's the thing.
That came out in 2009.
That's the thing though, right? Is I don't know with a game like that because like League of Legends now isn't the same game it was when it came out, right? So like, does that matter? Like, I think it does. Whereas like, I don't know, like World of Warcraft, right? Is like that's a World of Warcraft or League of Legends or any game like that is constantly evolving, and the game that it is now is not the game it was when I started playing it, over 10 years ago or whatever, right? Like, and I don't think that you can necessarily like discount, games that are not living products that keep getting updated because of a similar trajectory. You know what I mean? Like, because like World of Warcraft, right? Like we're talking about still contemporary, all that stuff. Let's see. This game came out in 2004. Okay. So what other games came out in 2004? Because I bet you
that's a long time ago. That's original Xbox era.
Okay. So
PS2
is that
the Xbox 360 came out in 2005.
So is that retro?
That's the I think where I'm landing that retro is.
So with that in mind then, like I think we need to agree that you need to remove games as a service from the conversation.
Yeah, I think we do, yeah.
Unless a game has a end date where it stopped, like something like Team Fortress 2, right? Which still people still play. You could still play.
But they're playing like a community version. It's not like he's getting updates.
It's a dead game
from Valve, yeah.
Right. And that's I think different than World of Warcraft or League of Legends or Fortnite will be in like 5 more years when Fortnite is still relevant. Like it's like I think you could argue that like season 2 of League of Legends is retro now. And if you go back and look at what that game looked like then and how it played then versus how it plays now, it would look old. So, interesting. So, Trendy Brendy wrote in and said, retro, quote unquote, in terms of marketing, I think varies from game to game. I don't think that's rigid. Like if THQ wants to market that new SpongeBob 3D platformer like they're making a quote unquote retro style, then they're referring to like the PS2 era of 3D platformers. Yeah, and that's the thing, right? I would say that's retro, But it's also
that's like a collectathon, right? Like a 3D collectathon. But this is the difference between this is the two different lines that I draw, right? What makes a game retro style and what makes a game actually retro? Because for a while, I feel like we were categorizing anything that was pixel art as, oh, that's a retro game.
No,
right?
I don't think
people would look at it.
It's retro style, retro inspired.
Yeah, retro style. Like they would look at, say, Shovel Knight, for example, and go, oh, that's a retro style game. Now we've moved into like 3D games that can also be retro in style, like that SpongeBob game that you mentioned. Yeah. Ukulele, for example, was like a retro style game.
I mean, well, here I'd love to bring this up. I think that extends beyond that. I would argue that Outer Worlds is a retro style game because that was a game made by a team on a smaller budget, and it was trying to replicate like Xbox 360, PS3 era Western RPGs. It's like, is that not in some way a retro style game? Because it's targeting.
I don't think so, because people still make that style game. Like I don't feel like it became antiquated. Bethesda makes that game.
No, they don't.
what you think Outer Worlds is not like a Bethesda game?
It is, but Fallout 4 is not like Outer Worlds. Fallout 4 is less that
Oh, I
kind of
disagree. I think
game.
Fallout, but I feel like the difference is that comes from Obsidian, a team of people who focus more on the role play aspect in their games than Bethesda ever did. But I think the gameplay very much played like a Fallout game, I think.
Yeah, but it's more old school in its execution than modern, or at least the most recent Bethesda RPG of that style is.
Yeah, maybe. I'm interested to see what uh Starfield is like, because feel like there's going to be influence from them, and it kind of
Yeah, I
going
think
back full circle.
it's going to be interesting. So here's another one. This one comes from Spring Hill Rick, and this was the initial comment that started this whole conversation over on the Discord. Listening to the recent episode on YouTube, I guess the way I considered retro is right before PS2 era, meaning anything from the beginning to Dreamcast, PS1 and N64 peaks would be it. My apologies for not thinking it all the way through. And then later on in the conversation, he commented and said, when it comes to retro gaming, I think the line in modern day is anything before the advent of DLC. So I said like pre-360, and he said I would think so. So he kind of like...
Okay, so that's two conflicting things, right?
Right.
Because that's a generation apart, and I would agree with the pre-360 thing, and not because of DLC. I don't think DLC is the reasoning as to why it is defined as retro. I feel like the 360 was the moment where the gaming industry kind of got in its stride and really matured into what it is today. And I don't feel like we've had as many technological breakthroughs since then. It's when we started seeing engines like Unreal and middleware and things being used on consoles. Prior to that, it was very much all like proprietary stuff where we're coding directly on the metal. You know, we're using assembly, things like that on the earlier consoles like the Mega Drive and the PlayStation. And so I feel like the 360 and the PS3 is like the era where we've got built-in operating systems on the consoles, and they're working a lot more like a modern day console. I think you could look at that console and you can see its similarities to like a PS5 or a Xbox Series
to this
X.
era.
Yeah. Whereas I don't think you would look at, say, a PS1 or a PS2 and go, wow, this is very different. This is like, I've got to plug in a controller for starters. Like the cables coming out the back of the console is not HDMI. It's like, you know, these weird like yellow and red things that plug into certain sockets.
So is that where you draw the line? Like
I think it's technically, yeah, I think it's PS2. But I feel like it's going to shift a generation every single time.
Yeah,
I may even discount the original Xbox 360 that didn't have an HDMI cable because you had to use component leads. My TV doesn't take in component.
I don't think you can make the line mid-generation. I think it's got to be a console generation.
Well, see, I don't think it does. I think if you're saying it's based on number of years, that's not a console generation.
Okay, so you're arguing that like you think early days of Xbox 360 are significantly different than later days of Xbox 360. That might be a good argument considering that generation is so long, too.
Yeah, that generation started in 2005.
It's the length of 2.
2013. It's like ridiculously long.
I don't know about that. All right, so then last comment from the audience before we get in to the debate here and we draw the line in the sand, Steve. So Zayd wrote in and said, I think I'm with Asobi. 10 years minimum for me. I think 10 years is a sufficient amount of time between where games are at graphically and what's in them. By 2025, it'll have been 10 years since The Witcher 3 released, and I'm sure open world games will be much more expansive and we'll probably interact with them in a different manner. I like that point too. The idea of like the way that we interact with games being different. And I think that connects back to the argument that you're making. But I think I disagree on where the line is, even though I think I fundamentally agree with you. Because I think if you, because right, we break video games down into generations, but I think if you want to get like really fucking nerdy about it, you could apply like the age mentality to video games, right? Like, to draw like an analog that some people might be familiar with, that's common in like cinema or like in comic books has a similar thing where there's like the golden age of Hollywood, right? And that describes a specific era of films. And like, there's usually a lot of like stylistic overlap in an era, right? And it might be 10 years, it might be longer than that. And like that's a thing in comics. There's like the golden, silver, and bronze and modern ages of comics, right? And like you have these kind of like, stylistic waves, genre waves, but also just like what were the attitudes and sensibility of consumers at the time, like who was the primary audience for video games at the time, like that kind of thing. So I think like if you start thinking about it in that way, and you were kind of making this distinction where it's like I feel like you have like the if you really want to get crazy about it, right? Like there's like the OG like coin-op gaming era, right? Which is like pre-video games. You have the like coin-op to arcade dominance era. You have the home console, like the first wave of home consoles, right? Which are like the pre-Nintendo era. And then leading up to the
you're
video
missing
game.
out like PCs in this and like computer gaming and stuff. I know that wasn't like I don't know, that was more massive here than it was.
I would say that's
America.
part of that though, because it's like there's like the pre-Nintendo era is like when you had the dominance of like Atari and Coleco and all that stuff here, and you all had like Intellivision or not Intellivision,
Sinclair Spectrums and we had Commodores and
Commodore.
Amigas.
That was the one I was thinking of. Yeah, right. So like, and those are all contemporary, right? And then you have like the post video game crash era that started with the NES, and then that is kind of like the era that I think defines, like in the same way that you said like the Xbox 360 and the PS3 are the first set of consoles that established kind of the status quo for how consoles are now. I think that era is like the blueprint of like how we think of video games being what they are. Right, like that was
I feel like it was up until the N64. Like, I feel like the NES and the SNES and that, like you can lump 8 and 16-bit and maybe even some 32-bit.
That's volume one of that era,
like the Jaguar and stuff. But then the PS1 and the N64, even going into PS2 and GameCube, that was like early 3D. It's like we're now having to learn again. Like we'd mastered pixel art and putting these games onto cartridges. Now we've got to learn all new technology again and figure out new methods of doing all of this stuff. And the hardware wasn't really powerful enough for it.
And I think like it's interesting, right? Because where you draw the line there is interesting. Because like, do you consider that era of consoles the end of volume one of the home console era? Or is it like a weird middle era where you do like the PS1, N64, Dreamcast into the PS2? Because the PS2, GameCube, Dreamcast stuff is where you started, and Xbox is where you started experimenting with all the stuff that you just described as being defining in the next generation, right? The PS2 was the first time that a console became a living room box, and it was the cheapest way to get a DVD player, and PS2s invaded everybody's living rooms, and
you had the Dreamcast, first console to go online and play online games, and then the Xbox obviously did online, and it had like access to the media stuff as well, like you could play DVDs and things on it and CDs. But I don't know, I feel like those are different. They're not, to me, what a modern console is. It's not what I consider a modern console to be.
It's the proto to that.
Yeah, it very much is. It's like we're getting there, but even the PS1 was like, it was like, oh, okay, this one plays CDs, and then the next one plays DVDs, and then the next one after that plays Blu-rays, and like you can see that the lineage of Sony's got like a new disc format. Let's do something with it, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I also think that that's an interesting thing, right? Is like the format where it's like you had like the cartridge era, you had the disc era, and then it's like as we move into like the modern era of consoles, right? Which I would agree with you starts with the 360 and the PS3. That's also when we developed the online solution and having the digital storefront where you could buy independent games, and like that is probably the most significant shift in the video game industry, you know, ever. Might be hyperbolic, but I would say probably at least since the introduction of the NES and the reintroduction of the home console, because like that totally changed the game of what kind of video games got made and what kind of games you had access to, and like.
No, I would agree with you. Like the Xbox Arcade really changed the game. You know, Sony were behind the curve on that, and obviously Steam started publishing games as well in 2005 for other publishers, and then opened that up and expanded it to indies with like Steam Greenlight and things like that.
Honestly, that's even an important signifier, right? Of like Steam coming out at about the same time as the 360 and the PS3 and Wii were coming out. Like that's a era defining moment, right? Because that basically brought PC gaming back from the dead.
Mm-hmm.
It had been totally irrelevant on a grand scale during the PS2, Xbox, Dreamcast era because they just couldn't keep up.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy that the PC gaming is now considered to be, you know, the next level, right? It's like we're using these graphics cards that are vastly outpower what you can get into a console versus what it was back in the day where, you know, my dad struggled to get Tomb Raider to run on his PC, so we bought a PlayStation so he could play the game.
Yep.
And it was just like, that's what people did. It was when you want to play games, you buy a console, you plug it into your TV. But I feel like there's multiple lines that I could draw it in. I like the eras. I do agree with that. I feel like the modern era for me started in like 2005. It was the 360 launched. We've got modern consoles that can connect to modern TVs today. Like if you want to plug a PS1 or a PS2 into your TV today, it's not a simple process of I just plug the cables in. It's going to be a case of I've got to get some kind of adapter, I've got to get some kind of box to plug it in and up-res and scale it up. They were designed for CRTs. The first consoles that were designed for the TVs we have in our homes today were the Xbox 360 and the PS3. And the PS3 specifically has HDMI. The original Xbox 360 models didn't. And I feel like that would probably be the line I draw. That anything pre that, I would like right now, I would consider retro. And that's about what, 17 years ago? 17 years, so I would maybe say 15 years. Anything 15 years and older, I would consider retro.
Interesting. So wait, okay. You're saying anything 15 years is the line. What? And you said that there's two lines, though. What was the other line?
Yes, so I think the other line is like a stylistic line. So yeah, technology at that point was like, this is what we can deliver, and technologically any game from that period onwards would be seen as like a modern game because it'll use like Unreal Engine, it'll use modern rendering techniques, but then stylistically it will feel different as well. Like there's a reason they're remaking The Last of Us aside from graphics, right? And that's only a 9-year-old game. In that time, the way games feel and play and gameplay choices and the way we tell stories in video games has changed.
I think that speaks to the era thing, right? Where it's like there are, because there's even like eras of like individual genre, right? Of like, think of how much the first person shooter has changed and evolved since Doom. You know?
Well, yeah, there's Doom, then we went to like Quake and that style of game. Like it was Doom and Wolfenstein, then we went to Quake.
Arena shooters, right?
Yeah, and like all the arena shooters that we had. Now I think we had Half-Life, which kicked off another era of like
Halo.
A first-person shooter that also told a story. Then we had Halo, yeah. So there's like a bunch of milestone games that hit and really changed the game, changed the way we perceived it. But 15 years ago is what, 2007?
Yeah. So here's my thing with that. You said 2007. I brought up 2008 in video games to try to establish where we're comfortable with that line being. So you're telling me that Left 4 Dead, the original Left 4 Dead, is not a retro game? Because that...
No, I don't think it is.
How? Really? And it becomes one next year.
I don't think the original Left 4 Dead is... I don't think it is.
But is it next
Like,
year?
think technically though, like that uses the Source engine. It's got physics-based mechanics, and it's like it is a modern game. It's not like when we look at something like pre Half-Life 2, for example, where there's no physics in the game. It's just like, how the fuck does this, like, how did we play games with no physics in?
I don't know. It's interesting.
And it's tough.
It's interesting because like I see what you're saying in terms of like it's calling it a modern game. I think feels very generous, but I recognize your point in that it's not as non-modern as something pre-2007.
Yeah, like, say games released in 2004, for example, that's when Half-Life 2 came out. Like, Half-Life 2 was 2004, the original Far Cry was 2004.
So let me ask you this, though, okay? Because you've said now 2007 is the line if we're operating under a 15-year window, right?
Yeah.
Okay. BioShock is on that list. I would argue that BioShock feels just as modern in the way that Left 4 Dead does.
Yeah, maybe even more so.
So what's up with that?
This is the difficulty, right? Like, I feel like the line is like jagged. It's not a straight line.
That's why I don't.
It very much depends.
That's why I don't think you can define it based on what you're saying.
But I don't think you can define it based on generations either, because I feel like Half-Life 2 still feels modern, and maybe this is the difficulty because that came out on a PC at the time when we had original Xbox and PS2, and so it's kind of an outlier. But that game changed everything. Like, it introduced physics to people in video games, and like moving the crates and things around, and we got Portal because of it.
But I don't think that game's modern by any stretch of the imagination. That game's very antiquated by modern.
It is antiquated, yeah, but I don't feel like I don't know. I don't know if I would consider Half-Life 2 retro. Like, I feel like it could do with a remaster.
I 100% think that Half-Life 2 is retro. I think you're crazy if you think Half-Life 2.
So do you think Portal's a retro game as well?
Cuz when did Half-Life 2 come out? 2004.
2004.
Yeah. Dude, no way. Like, if you gave that game right now to a modern player, right? Like, even me.
It's difficult. You have loading screens, and
even forget loading screens. Say you've got it on. You're taking advantage of the Xbox load times, and it's like you cut all that, and it's just based on.
No. Honestly, it's the most bizarre thing. You'll be walking on a map, and it will just come up with loading ... and then it will like freeze the game.
That's insane.
Like, there's no like.
And you think you think that's modern?
I don't. I think that's the start of what I consider a modern game to be. 2004 is the start of what I consider a modern game to be. But I don't necessarily think that is a modern game. Like, the original Far Cry came out in 2004 as well.
Grand Theft Auto San Andreas came out that year. Halo 2 came out that year.
Metal
Gear Solid 3 came out that year.
I think that one game is an outlier, and I don't think you can go back as far as 2004. I think 2007... at the moment, it's probably a good cutoff year for me, and that's why I think 15 years. Because 2006,
not one game
we had like Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, for example, and I feel like that's far enough back for me to go. 2007. Yeah,
I don't think that
15 years
modern.
Is probably the cutoff.
2006. Now you're saying?
No, but I think 2007. I think is a fine cutoff period for me.
15 years. I don't know. All right, All right. So here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna go
again. It's really tough because there's some games I feel like you could say no, that still feels modern, right?
Yeah, but I think that
like
has
Portal. That's the 2007 game.
I think that has more to do with the game itself than the year or the era. Right? Like, there are games that are because, like, I don't know, dude, right? Like, Dragon Age Origins, right, came out in 2009. I'm playing that right now. That game feels old as fuck. It doesn't mean that it's not good. It doesn't mean that it doesn't hold up. It doesn't mean that there aren't things about it that are modern. But, like, it doesn't feel like a game that came out in 2022. Right? And
No, of course it's not going to, but you could play a game that's like 5 years old and it wouldn't feel like it came out in 2022. Like they're
you don't
re-releasing
think
The
that's
Last of Us.
significant though? I feel like that's a
I don't
significant
think
thing
that
to
makes
consider.
it. I don't think that is what defines it as retro though, because like if you went back to the beginning of the last generation and you went and played Knack, I don't think you're gonna have a good time with it. I don't think you're gonna think,
But I
wow,
think
this
that's
is a
just because
great
that
game.
game sucks. Pick a good game. You know
I
what I
can't
mean?
think of any other games that came out in 2013. What came out that year? It was like a bit of a dud, wasn't it?
Let's find out. 2013, we have BioShock Infinite, Grand Theft Auto 5, The Last of Us, The Legend of Zelda:
Okay,
Link Between
right.
Worlds.
So GTA 5, The Last of Us, and Tomb Raider. That's like the beginning of the last generation. I can't consider any of those retro. Like, yeah, The Last of Us doesn't play as good on a PS3 as it would on, say, the PS5 when the remake comes out, but I don't think it feels like a retro game.
That's 9 years ago.
So that's coming up to 10 years. Next year, that'll be 10 years, and I don't
Yeah.
think GTA 5 and The Last of Us can be considered retro games.
So that's interesting because I think I agree with you there. Now here's the thing. Here's a question. Retro, by definition, right, is
Webster's dictionary defines retro.
I believe so.
as-
Yes, imitative of a style, fashion, or design from the recent past.
Yes. And that, I think, is versus like vintage, right? Which is this. That's where I think retro is retro in style. That's the actual definition of it. I think in video games, it's never been used that way. When people
Yeah.
think retro video games, they go, "Oh, you're playing like an old Mario game."
But like, there's an interesting question there, though. I think as well. Springhill Rick wrote in. I don't have it pulled up in front of me, but it was in the Discord, and I remember him saying that like, if you had a modern, like a young person now play like an Atari game, right? Like that's like ancient to them. Like that's even older than retro, right? Which is interesting.
It is. Yeah.
I don't know if that's relevant to the conversation we're having right now, but it's an interesting question.
So there's a conversation as we're recording this going on in the Discord, and Asobi's made the point that retro is different for every person because it taps into nostalgia for that person.
Sure.
And it's what they consider to be retro. So that when you go, oh, I wish they'd make a Pokemon game like the retro Pokemon games, like the old style ones, is what you remember. And like retro to people these days who are like
Younger than
18
us.
now, 20 now, retro might be Minecraft because it's what they played when they were 5.
I mean, that game also came out a long time ago. Like that game came out in
It
2009. Like it's not
But that's
not
one of
retro.
those ones that's one of those ones you have to discount because
Right.
that is like a living game. It's constantly updated.
Right. So here's the thing I'm trying to do. I'm going through year by year, and I want to see where I feel like the line is for me.
Okay. The line for me is 2007. I think 15 years is a nice number.
So I want to figure out where I feel like the line is, and then we'll have to debate on where it is for us as an organization. So here we go. We're at 2010 in video games. I've got Red Dead Redemption, Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, Mass Effect 2, God of War 3, Super Mario Galaxy 2. Those games feel old as fuck to me.
Yeah, some of those do. But some of them are like, but you go back a year or go forwards a year and they don't feel old.
And I'm also like,
And that's
2010,
the problem. It's very dependent on the game.
2010 is the year I graduated high school. Like, that's
Yes.
a long time ago. That's a long time. Like, that is an era ago, right? Like, so much has come and gone and changed in the culture, right? Like, and I think that feels significant to me. Not necessarily like the personal line for me, like as an individual, but I just mean like 2010 is over a decade ago. That to me is like, that feels significant. That feels like a significant chunk of time. The 2010s versus the 2020s, you know?
All right, well, let's go up to 2012 then.
Okay.
Let's go all the way up to that cutoff because I don't think I can in good conscience say 2013. And then maybe the line is drawn that it's a generation before last, which would be 2012 because that would be the end of the last generation.
That
And, you
that
know,
to me feels
it's-
more right.
So you got Mass Effect 3, Dishonored, Far Cry 3. And like I'm struggling with some of those. Like Far Cry 3 now, if you play that and you play that on like an Xbox Series X, it still feels like a Far Cry game. It still feels modern. And it looks great.
Yeah. But is that what we're debating?
And like Hotline Miami's on here. That's a game you've been playing.
It's true.
I don't know what we're debating. We're debating what a retro game is. Is it like? And I think that's what I mean. There's
No,
like
but,
two
like, I'm
lines. It's
asking-
like that technical line versus how the game feels and plays.
Right, and that's the thing is I don't think you can base it on how a game feels and plays. Because you yourself have made the argument that games from the 16-bit era feel and play and hold up better than games from the era after that. Right? So I think
the PS1 era is just trash.
I don't think you can argue that it has to do with how good a game feels. Like I think the fact that Far Cry 3 looks and runs and feels good on modern tech doesn't make it not old.
No, like, but like it, as in not like technically looks and feels good, as in it plays like a modern shooter. It doesn't play like Doom.
Okay.
Like Far Cry
So-
3 and Dishonored both feel like modern first-person games.
But didn't we make that same argument about BioShock? Which is
Yes, we did.
several years older, and we're teetering on the line there. And
Yeah,
those
so
are
next year-
those are games from the same generation, which is interesting to me. Because you feel like, and this is where that half thing comes in. You are arguing that first half of that generation feels retro, back half of it doesn't.
Yeah.
And I wonder if we would be having this much of a debate if the recession hadn't happened at that point and video game consoles had advanced at the rate they had prior.
I don't know. Maybe, but I also think that of the Sony being a year late didn't help either.
It's just interesting. It's interesting because I feel like you compare Mass Effect 1 to Mass Effect 3 and Uncharted 1 to Uncharted 3. There's a massive level, or to Last of Us. There's a massive level of difference between those games and how much game design
and that's like the
evolved
start and the end of the generation.
during that generation. Yeah.
And that's why I feel like we can't fix it based on generations. It's got to be a time thing. And I think 15, it breaks off some games, and I think we just have to accept that some games are outliers because Half-Life 2 was released in 2004.
That game does not feel modern. I will not accept that.
Half-Life 2 versus, say, the original Far Cry or Chronicles of Riddick or Fable, the original Fable. I feel like those games, they're not on the same level.
I think Chronicles of Riddick feels more like a modern game than Half-Life 2 by a lot.
What?
Yes. Straight up and down. Chronicles of Riddick, Escape from Butcher Bay, right, is the one?
That's the one.
That was on Xbox. That is way more like a modern story-based shooter. I think that game has more in common with something like Control than Half-Life does. In terms of, like, you have a voiced character, you're going through story interactions and then cutscenes.
Yeah, but you've also argued in like the last episode that voiced protagonists are crap, and like that's the whole point.
That's not what we're talking about.
Gordon Freeman.
I'm not arguing quality. I'm not saying that Escape from Butcher Bay is a better game than Half-Life 2. I'm saying it's a more modern game. That's a different argument. Also, voice protagonists aren't inherently bad. They're bad for role-playing games. Neither of these games are role-playing games. So don't
I think
twist my words.
I think you're probably right there. But I do feel like people get in the zone when they're playing the Freeman.
Yeah, and that's it's not a value judgment. It's just like there would not be a modern game, no modern first-person shooter with a named protagonist has a silent protagonist anymore. That's like not a thing. You know? BioShock did it, but that's a retro game.
Mm-hmm.
Because an Infinite, which you are arguing is not a retro game, has a voiced protagonist.
But that's the style choice again. Like it's not like I was saying technically in terms of Half-Life, right? It's not stylistically, but technically it uses modern rendering techniques. It used a game engine. It added physics into the mix. Those were things that weren't in other games then.
Yeah, but I think I would argue that makes it more proto modern than modern, right? Where it's like, and I use that word because it's familiar to me when talking about like punk music, right? Where it's like there are bands like The Who or like the Velvet Underground, things like that, where it's like I wouldn't call them punk bands, but they did things that certainly influenced the development of that genre later on, right? And like I think that is significant, where like that's a different thing in my mind. Half-Life 2 being an extremely influential game that made the next that was the game that inspired what would be the next generation of first-person shooters that learned a lot from Half-Life. I'm with you there. I agree. I think that makes sense to me, but I think that makes it more old than modern.
And it is very fucking old. It's 2004.
It's
and
almost
that's like
20 years. It's closer to 20 years old than 15 years old.
Yeah, and I think that's.
You can't tell me a 20-year-old game is modern.
No, it's not. Absolutely not.
So I think that's just.
I've given you my line. My line's 2007. I'm waiting for your line.
Well, I know. I'm just trying to have the dialogue with you. I'm trying to have the. So I feel like. The line is closer to me to like 2010.
Really?
I do.
So next year will be 2011, right? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and I feel like that to me feels like a good draw. And you know why I feel that way? Is 2011, I think the games on that list, it's a much easier argument to say that they feel modern. I think, so on the list, right, for 2011 in video games, we have Arkham City, Portal 2, Skyrim, Skyward Sword, and Uncharted 3 Drake's Deception. That was also the year that the 3DS came out. I think Arkham City and Skyrim and Uncharted, I would say to some degree, those games to me feel way more akin to a quote-unquote modern video game. I think Uncharted 4 is a lot more like Uncharted 3 than Uncharted 1, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think Arkham City feels like a blueprint for what modern open-world games look like. Skyrim, same thing, right? In a different way. Less box-checky and more like the immersive.
Yeah, like Skyrim, look at what happened in the last 5 years from Oblivion to this. So, like, I can't believe it only took them 5 years to make that game. It's kind of insane when you think about it. But
you know what I mean, though?
I don't know.
Like, I think 2011.
Yeah, 2000. I feel like
games,
next year I don't want these games to be considered retro, which is what you're saying it would be.
Yeah.
I feel like that's too close. That's why I feel like 15 years gives that little bit of leeway, got a bit more buffer room.
Let me ask
Otherwise,
you this.
you're going what, 12 years?
Let me ask you this, though, Steve. Do you think it's possible that when Starfield comes out, that you then look at Skyrim and you're like, oh, this does now feel retro? Because we've had the next step and the next evolution.
I feel like people already feel like we've had the next step and the next evolution. Like, it's all I heard when The Witcher came out.
Take it back to Zaid's comment, though, right? Maybe that's the thing, right? Like, is that like, oh, if Starfield comes out and it's the next step in open worlds and you're like, wow, oh my God, this is so much deeper than The Witcher 3 and so much deeper than Skyrim, like, does that then make that feel retro? Does that then make that feel like, this is the Half-Life 2 of this, in this analogy?
So, I've gone back to Skyrim in recent memory. I replayed that entire game through on the Switch. It didn't once feel like, wow, I'm playing a retro game. I didn't once think
when you replayed it, though, when did you replay it? 2017? When it was...
I mean, it was like 3 years ago.
That's a long time ago. You know, like that's now... that's a different time in gaming, I think. And again, I'm not arguing that that's retro, but 3 years ago, okay, maybe. But like, you're telling me now when we're going to get the first big Xbox Series X exclusive game of this genre from this developer that's supposed to be the next big step forward, that's not going to make a game that was the big thing for that 2 console generations ago feel old? I'm not trying to convince you of anything. It's a genuine question.
Maybe, but I feel like...
Because would you have thought Oblivion felt old in 2010? Before Skyrim
I did
came
think
out?
it felt... No, because there wasn't anything else like it.
Exactly.
I think that was the problem.
Exactly. So
I would
argue...
I'm looking at 2008's games, which again is the 15-year cutoff. And we've got like the Fallout 3s, the Dead Spaces, the GTA 4, Fable 2, Far Cry 2, Mirror's Edge. I feel like these feel more retro to me.
I would say these games are squarely retro. They're definitely in that camp, in my mind.
And that's why I feel like, you then go forward a year to 2009, and they're feeling less retro, with like a Left 4 Dead 2 and a Dragon Age Origins and a Resident Evil 5.
I don't know. I think those games all feel very old. I think like in Infamous is it also a game that feels very old if you go back and play it now.
Yeah, maybe 14 years is the cutoff then. I don't know, which is 2 generations, 7 for 7, isn't it? So maybe 14 years is the cutoff, but I feel like 15 is a nice round number, so that's why I went with it.
I feel ya. I really feel like it's 2010. I feel like that's the line. Because 11 is where I really feel like by next year, some of these games are going to feel old. I really do.
I don't know.
You're telling me God of War 3?
I feel like it depends on the games and when these were released. I mean, this is 5 years into a generation. It was like the mid-gen lull. And like...
2010?
Well,
it's
no,
not
it's
a
not.
lull. Red Dead Redemption, Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, Mass Effect 2, Super Mario Galaxy 2. That's like some of the best games of that generation.
Yeah. You could be right. 2010 is looking. I would look at these and go, yeah, I don't really want to play any of those. And same with 2011. Yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe 2010. But like, what is that? What are you counting that as? Are you saying we're saying 12 years is the cutoff?
Well, when did that generation
12
end?
years or older?
When did that generation end?
2013.
So I think to me, like I think maybe we are coming down on it's halfway through a console generation. So it's not. So it would be 1.5 console generations ago. Would be when something becomes retro.
Yeah, which is so arbitrary that I feel like
the whole conversation's arbitrary.
That's why I wanted to put
you want to put a nice
number on
year on it.
Yeah.
I just feel like 15 is a nice round number, but like I don't feel like it's representative of the debate.
That's over one generation, and I feel like you're probably right. That's because the 360 era went on forever. So,
like, if you cut it in half,
counting that, and we say the generations are 6-7 years old, 7 years plus another half generation gets us to 10, maybe 11.
So then we're back at 10 years being the line.
Yeah, which gets us to 2013 for next year. If we're going with next year, and again, I struggle with that year because of GTA 5 and The Last of Us.
I'm not gonna lie to you. That feels a little off to me, but I think that to me feels better than 2007, which feels way too old. Because I feel like 8 to 10 is a very similar caliber of games in terms of what we've been talking about, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if 15 years will be 2008, and that's GTA 4, and Dead Space, and Fallout 3, anything earlier than that is now considered retro.
And I feel like Dragon Age Origins being on the wrong side of that line feels weird. Now that I'm playing it right now,
only for a year. It's shifting every single year. Isn't
next
it,
year it would be retro.
Yeah.
And how many years is that? 2009? We're saying that's 17? Or no, 13.
No, 2000. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. If we want to split the difference and call it 13, I'm okay with that. Because I'm saying 10 and you're saying
15.
14.
That's 14.
Okay.
But anything, I guess it would be 13 if you're saying that next year it's becoming that. So anything 2009 earlier is 13.
Right. Okay.
I don't know. It's a really tough one because I think it's because the variations in the games, and because some of these games took so long to develop. Like the style was set in stone.
I think that's why I think rather than saying it's 13, it's whatever, I think it's a generation and a half. Because I think you can look at most console generations and see that the caliber of games that come out at launch are different than the caliber of games that come out at the end of the life cycle, right? Like compare like the first PlayStation published game on PS2 to God of War. Massive difference, right? Compare the first PS3 published game to The Last of Us. Massive difference. So I think if you say it's a gen and a half, I think that gets you to the point where you're like, the stuff that's near the end of the generation that feels more akin to what's current, right? Like your Last of Us Part 2s and your Ghost of Tsushima's in relevance to the current generation, that to me feels good. Because then you're saying that like, you know, the PS4, right? Like next generation, right? It would be like Infamous 2 and like maybe Bloodborne and some of the like early PS4 exclusives that you'd be like, those are on the retro side of things, but surely Ghost of Tsushima and The Last of Us Part 2 are not yet retro, right? You know what I mean? I feel like that feels right.
So a generation and a half, and is that discounting the current generation? So it's the last generation and then a half. So it's halfway through the PS3's generation. That's what you're saying? Or is this constantly shifting? So when we're halfway through the PS5's generation, we're saying the beginning of the PS4 is retro.
It shifts every half generation. So halfway through the PS5 life cycle.
How do we know what that is? Because we don't know when this generation's going to end. You don't.
That's the thing, though. You can't. It's history, right? So we can only judge it in antiquity with hindsight. In the moment, it's going to be hard to say, and I think that's when you get into minutia and you get into an argument that comes down to like nostalgia and age and all those other things. But if we're trying to look at it in like a more like sociological, academic way, I think that's a safe place for us. And it feels like that meets both of our criteria with enough wiggle room to argue where the line is. So it's got to be 15 years, it's got to be 10 years. Because like 12 years is an absurd answer. And eventually that will be wrong, right? If we get to a point where we're back on 5-year life cycles, that'll get to a place where you're like, that's bullshit and it doesn't apply anymore. Because you'd be like 2.5 generations in on a 5-year life cycle. 12 would be nonsense, right?
Yeah, but I also feel like this is going to be irrelevant moving forwards anyway with technologies like smart delivery and things like that. I feel like the games that we're playing now, especially with more and more live service games, it's going to feel less and less like we're playing retro games.
That's why I think
games are going to follow us.
You have to. That's why we had the whole thing about the technical thing, though. I think you have to move beyond technical, and I think it's more about style and game design and like the modern live surface free to play shooter thing, right? That's a genre development. That's an era defining genre development. Whereas like during the 360 PS3 era, the dominant form of like first person shooter was the lobby based, arena shooter, racking kills up, like your Halos, your Call of Duties, right? Like those games are still around, but they're no longer like the dominant thing in that conversation. And even if they still are, it's because they've adopted this new model of like the always online games as a service, battle royale, like all that stuff. And like 10 years from now, I think we'll look back on that and be like, that was an era. That was a moment in games when battle royale was everything and Fortnite made $1 billion a month. And will it still be around? Will people still play it? I'm sure, but it won't be what it was because the new wave will have come, right? In the same way that like Halo Infinite came out and found an audience, but it's not recapturing Halo's glory days in terms of cultural relevance and sales and all that shit, right? And I think that's going to be the more significant descriptor as we do the thing that you said, right? Where every generation, the technological leap is less significant, and like we probably won't have another major leap the way we did when we had pre-OS consoles to OS consoles, right? Like we'll probably never see a leap like that again. And now it's going to be more about like what are the kinds of experiences you were having during that generation.
Yeah, because I feel like I feel like the thing we're gonna look back on this generation and feel is how much of a letdown ray tracing on the consoles was. I don't think we're gonna see it come to fruition as much as I would have liked, because I just don't think the GPUs in those consoles can handle it. And maybe that's what we'll see next generation. It'll finally be like, or maybe that's the mid-gen refresh. Maybe that's the point where we start calling it. It's just like, okay, now beginning of the PS4 is fair game to call retro, because it's like the PS5 Pro's out.
That's interesting too, because I feel like even console manufacturers have recognized that there's like a half generation point where like there is a significant difference, and like I think that speaks to what we're talking about, right? Like I think the PS5 Pro came out, that did kind of start Gen 2 of the PS4 era.
Yeah, and One X absolutely did, because it took the original Xbox One, which was vastly underpowered, and transformed it into the most powerful console again. It was what Microsoft wanted. They wanted to be the number one console again in terms of power.
There you go. So I think we've
a generation and a half. A generation and a half. That's what we're saying.
I think
that's
so.
An absolute nonsense, but yeah, okay, I can go with a generation and a half.
I think it makes sense. I think the more we talk about it, the more I'm aligned that makes sense. I'm interested to hear what the kids think now that we've had this debate. I hope this conversation was as interesting to listen to as it was to have. This was very fun.
I feel like people are going to want a number, and a generation and a half, I feel like that is 10, 11 years. So maybe we figure it out, but let us know what you think.
It's a sliding scale, So here's my question to you, Steve. We've gone long. We clearly have no time for what we're playing. We have 2 questions in the question block that are very, very relevant to this week's topic. What do you say we close it out on those? Okay. All right, good. Okay. So this first one comes from Zaid, who says, what modern games... You know what? No. We just did a Zaid question. We're going to close out on Zaid's question. We're going to do this one from Spring Hill Rick, who writes in and says, also, since this is a great time for remakes... How far, or better to say, how close do you think the line is to remake/revive an IP? 5 years? 10 years? 25? Great question.
Yeah, okay. I feel like I don't think it's a time thing. I feel like it's are you telling the same story? Are you doing the same thing that original game? Are you taking the same maps and recreating them? Versus we're taking maybe the same characters and the same setting and the same theming, and it's a revival. Like I feel like Final Fantasy VII is kind of towing the line on it's not really a remake. It's more of a revival and making that game into its own series. They've announced there's going to be 2 more games coming to that series. I don't really feel like it's a remake anymore. It's a retelling, a reimagination. It's a revival, I think.
Yeah, and I think they're very different questions, right? Like a remake versus a revival. I think a remake, like when it comes to games, I think it's like, it's only a couple years, right? Because like you see it all the time now, right? Where like Ghost of Tsushima came out and like a year later we had the PS5 version.
Well, that was a remaster. Like a remake is something like Demon Souls went through, right? Because that's what you consider to be like a remake. Same with Final Fantasy VII, and The Last of Us is technically a remake.
So that's okay. You're making that distinction. So if you're thinking about it that way, then yeah, I mean, I would say probably like 10 years, right? Is roughly.
I would hope it's 10 years, because otherwise I still feel like they're towing the line on The Last of Us. 9 years is pretty close to remake it, but that's I kind of feel like it's because there was such a leap. I feel like if that had launched as a PS4 game and was a true PS4 game and came mid generation on it, like it was a PS4 Pro title, I don't feel we'd be getting a remake of it. We'll just get a PS5 remaster of it. But because that generation took the technology so far, I feel like that's why we're getting the remake of that game. That and money. Sure, money is also a very big factor.
Of course. I'm trying to hold on. Let me see. When did Fire Red and Leaf Green come out? because that's like the first Pokemon remake. And these games came out in, look at that, 2004. Which
Seven years? Oh no, that is 10 years, isn't it?
Yeah, I think. Because I'm trying to find out when Red and Green came out here now. 96. So even less than that.
But that was a time when the technology was also moving rapidly.
I think that's the point, though, right? Is like I think it has less to do with time and more to do with technology and like how worthwhile it is to remake something. And when it comes to like a revival, I think that has way more to do with the property and like what the hunger level is for it. Because I think that they've
got a new story to tell. Like, look at Hitman, for example.
Sure.
They wanted to start fresh and wipe the slate clean and have like a new springboard to go off with, bringing in people that never played that series before. I'd never played the series before, and I jumped in on the 2016 Hitman. Same with the 2016 Doom. It had a remake or a revival, sorry, and it was because they just wanted a fresh start with what they were doing.
And I think the same can be said of God of War, right?
Yeah.
Where like God of War, let's see, the last proper game was 2013. Then they had the collection on Vita a year later, and then God of War 3 remastered in 2015. And then we got God of War 2018, which was, of course, a revival, a reboot, a refresh, however you want to describe it. Was in 2018. That's only, 3 years from the last release of God of War, but it's 5 years removed from the last actual entry in the franchise. And granted, it's not quite a reboot in the conventional sense where like it does still acknowledge the history of the older titles, but like it's a revival, I think, and you couldn't argue that, right? Like it was clearly a new step for the franchise, getting away from the Greek mythology thing, trying to make something that's like more sensitive and emotional versus like high octane action and like sexuality and like all the things that I think you would like. If you think of God of War pre 2018, like it's a way different IP. It's a way different character. It's a different audience is coming to it for different things. And
yeah, that was one of the reasons I've never tried it, was because I didn't like the God of Wars that I'd played prior to it.
Yep. And I never played a God of War for myself prior to 2018. I had a friend that was into them and played like 1, 2, and 3. And like I was like, yeah, it's like a cool action game or whatever, but like even when I was young, I thought it was kind of cringy. Like I didn't like the like oversexed, like hyper violent, hyper masculine kind of like attitude of Kratos, and that's, again, those games are 5 years removed, and I think that was like perfect timing for that, right? Like that came out and felt fresh. So like I think a lot of it has to do with like how an IP has been treated, how much have we seen of it, like how long has it gone away in relation to how much we want it back, like there's a lot of, I think that's a way harder line
that
to
is
draw.
because if you're saying it's 5 years, next year's 5 years since God of War came out, the 2018 game, and I don't think you can say, oh, we're going to revive it, we're going to reboot again. You'd be like, what the fuck, why?
Right, but that's also because it's healthy right now.
Yeah, it's
right?
not
Like,
gone stale. And I think that's the thing. You've got to reboot it and revive it when it goes stale.
Yeah. All right, so we're going to close the day out on this question from Zaid, who wrote in and said, what modern games/franchises do you think would inspire the best retro spin-off? For example, do you think Horizon could inspire a 2D 16-bit style Mega Man game?
Okay, so now we're going with retro style.
Yeah.
So I guess it depends on... Yeah.
Well, we've established it's anything that's a generation and a half ago. So you can just you can answer that any way you want, Steven.
Wow. Yeah, I could see Horizon doing a Elder Scrolls Oblivion style game. Absolutely. Yeah, I'd love to like properly role. No, I don't know. Like you buy a house and stuff and you do it up. Do you know? I feel like we kind of already got it for like Fallout. That was like the Vault thing was already like a retro style game anyway. I loved that.
You mean the mobile game?
But yeah, I feel like that harked back to me to like the old Bullfrog style games like Theme Park and Theme Hospital and stuff, or Sim Hospital, where it was like an old management game.
Yeah, that
But
game was fun until my entire vault collapsed. I was playing it for like a couple of weeks and like had a really like well built out vault, and then we had a bad attack that like almost everyone except for like the old people and the children died, and I was like, oh, this vault is fucked. We're done.
oh, did you rage quit then? You're just like, I'm done with that.
I just was like, my story here is ended. Like my
Yeah.
vault collapsed, and oh well. Vault 42069, that's how it went down. I don't remember if that was the number, but that's what I'm gonna call it.
You know what?
I'm
you know
struggling
what
to
I would-
think of like a good modern IP to like try to think backwards with.
Yeah, I would really like to see Gran Turismo do a retro arcade style game. I feel like it's something that Sony's missing, that Microsoft's really capitalized on with Forza Horizon and taken that to like the next level.
I got it, Steve. I figured it out.
But I feel like if we could have like a Gran Turismo retro style arcade racer, something like an old school Ridge Racer, I feel like it'd be great. Or just bring Ridge Racer back. I mean, fucking hell, Namco. Like it's been way too long.
Real quick, I want you to give me your best Ridge Racer impression. You know, of the guy.
Ridge Racer.
Ridge Racer.
Oh god, have you gone back and watched any of those old presentations? Like, have you gone to watch the introduction of the PS3 and the PS Vita? And like,
not a long time.
The whole Ridge Racer bit is so cringe. Remember that one? He's like got the PSP up and is like, oh my god, it's so bad.
You've seen the PlayStation one, right? The announcement of the original PlayStation, where the guy just walks up and just goes $3.99 and he just leaves.
Yes,
That's just it. I was like, damn. All right, Sony.
I don't know who it was at the PlayStation like announcement that said the Ridge Racer thing. Oh, here it is. It's Ridge Racer. Yeah, it was in 2006. And it's the introduction. Kasserai gets really excited about like Ridge Racer on the PSP.
God bless him.
And he's like, oh yeah, look, Ridge Racer. Remember that one? It's just like, oh my god, it's so cringe.
Okay, I have two answers here. I think, and they're both like the kind of the same answer. So, bit of a cop out. We can keep thinking about more if you want. I think NBA 2K and WWE 2K would both benefit greatly from a retro style spinoff. I don't remember what the name of the hockey. It's like NHL, whatever. But like, there's like whatever the big hockey brand is. I remember. I don't know if it was the last one or if it was maybe 2 years ago. But that was a thing they did as a pre-order bonus, where you basically got a game that was a recreation of the classic, like I think it's 98, NHL 98 on PS1, that like is an old school like pixel art style game. People remember this game very fondly if you're a hockey person. And they took that game and just remade it with the modern roster so you could play that game with, who's ever on your team now, actually.
Okay, that's really cool, yeah.
I think that's
But you know what, you'd want like an NBA Jam style thing,
yeah,
wouldn't you? Like,
yeah.
You want like the arcade style rather than like the simulation thing.
Right, exactly. I literally want an NBA Jam game where I have, it's like, it's all the NBA teams and it's like 3-on-3 basketball, and you have whoever the three most popular players on any given team are, right? And it's like, I can like play as the Sixers and be like Joel Embiid, James Harden, and Tyrese Maxey, and I just play NBA Jam. Like, that's the experience that I want to have. And I feel like that would be so easy to do, right? And I think WWE is the same thing, right? Like, there's that whole era of classic arcadey wrestling games on like the N64, even up to the PS2. From my understanding, the most recent WWE 2K is actually pretty good and like has more of that kind of baked back in. So maybe that's not as relevant now, but I love that I loved old school wrestling, like arcadey wrestling games back in the day. They were a lot of fun, and I think like taking that old style and bringing it back and having like a roster that has like a bunch of old school classic, wrestlers from like bygone eras, but then really have like a lot of the new blood that people care about now. I think would definitely resonate with that audience, but also just with like the general game playing audience in a way that like I know a lot of kids that were not into WWE that played like Here Comes the Pain or Just Bring It or any of those kinds of games or older, right? Like No Mercy and all that shit. So I think those are both like no brainers, right? In my mind.
Another one that I would love, and it's probably because in recent memory we've been playing that Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles game on Twitch, is take something like the Spider-Man game on PS4 and do like a side-scrolling brawler where you're playing as like Spider-Man or some of the other like superheroes from like the Marvel universe, and like just have them go through. They've all got their special moves. Like Spider-Man could spin people up in a web, while other people just like fucking punch them in the face or whatever. I feel like I would have a good time with that game, even though I'm not a massive superhero person.
I feel like you could like do that as a thing. I think with more modern IP too. It feels like it's only like old IP that we are like, oh, let's go do that. Like, cause like I remember like the Scott Pilgrim game, like that came out contemporarily, and that was like really cool. And like I feel like you could probably like why isn't there like a Stranger Things beat 'em up, right? Or it's like,
Yeah, well, there's a Stranger Things game, but I've never played it.
I don't think it's very good. I think it's one of those kind of like cheapo tie-in, you know what I mean? Like, and it's like whatever, right? Like that's whatever. Like no shade, I've never played it, so it might be fine. But like something with the level of quality of Turtles would be cool, you know?
Yeah, because that game was so good.
It's
so
really fun. It's really well done. You know, like it's like even if like beat 'em ups aren't your jam, I feel like you can look at it and be like, oh, like there's so much care put into this. You know, like there's like the people that made this really, really gave a shit and like got into the minutia, and like I think that's the best thing you can do with the beat 'em up. Word on the street is they want to make a Simpsons game, and I'm like, okay.
Oh my god, please do. Yeah.
Sequel to
Please
the
do a
Simpsons
Simpsons
arcade game.
game.
Like that would be really cool. I feel like they would nail it. You have any others you can think of? I'm trying to think of like another modern IP that could make that jump. I guess you could do like Ghost of Tsushima as like a like like
what would
like
be
an
really
action
nice?
platformer.
Yeah, I could see that, like a Ninja Gaiden style thing.
Yeah, but like less vertical and like have it be more focused on like rather than like, oh, like you can jump and everything, like have it maybe be like a little bit more like Castlevania-y and like not necessarily like Metroidvania, but like more so like have it be very oriented around like the changing the style, right? Because like yeah, you never played that game. You really should. But like the whole you have like a regular stance if you're fighting somebody with a sword. There's a different stance if you're fighting somebody with a shield. There's a different stance if you're fighting like a big guy with a two-handed weapon.
Oh,
and
okay.
like that could be the whole thing where it's like, oh, like which enemy type am I encountering, and I need to switch to this stance and do this combo at the right way and have it be like a very like, use the right tool at the right time. Mega Man's kind of like that too, right? But like something like akin to that, I think I could see making sense.
Yeah, one that would be really good if we took Sonic Frontiers and we made a retro
And we made Sonic
game
Mania
instead.
2 instead. Yeah.
Yeah,
Love that
and we
idea,
actually
Steve.
made a good game. That would be great.
That's a really good idea. Man. Yeah, I feel like that's all I got. I'm trying to like pull for another one, and I think at this point it's just me being like, what if we took this game and made it like this game, and like I don't know that I have another good answer rather than like
Yeah, I
fishing.
always prefer original stuff. I feel like the indie devs have such creativity when they do their own
Yeah.
thing. Like look at Celeste, for example, and Hotline Miami,
Shovel Knight.
and yeah, Shovel Knight, and like all of that stuff. It's just like they can take their passion for those old retro style games and make something fresh and new that we've never seen before. Like I'm playing a Return of the Obra Dinn at the moment. It looks like an old game that runs on like Mac OS 7 or whatever, and it's phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. And we gave some good answers. We got something out there, so I'm comfortable with that. So yeah, thank you guys for writing in. Thank you everybody for being a part of this main topic. I thought this was a really fun discussion. I really enjoyed myself, as evidenced by the fact that this episode is very long compared to how long the show normally runs. So thanks everybody for tuning in. Thank you to those of you who wrote in. Please remember my challenge to write in with a name for the icebreaker segment. To write in with your own question or main topic, or to write in with your thoughts on any of the stuff we discussed today. Right? That's my challenge to you, the listener. Because otherwise, we got to come up with a topic for next week. And, I think it's more fun when we're building this together, guys. It's collaborative. It's a collaborative experience. Why not take on some of the work, right? Why not do that?
Yeah. It's all right. We've got a whole library of games that we've been planning to talk about at some point.
That's the thing. Now we're just saving it up. Next week we could just do what we're playing. That could be the whole show because it's been like a month since we've talked about it. So
yeah, don't forget to check out that Steam sale as well, Pete, because I'm sure you'll pick something up.
Dude, I've been avoiding it like the plague because I'm like afraid to go spend too much money.
I know. What's that Star Wars game?
The Star Wars game?
Yeah, the one that's not like you played.
Jedi?
It's not Return of the Jedi, because that's the fucking
Fallen Order.
Star Wars. Jedi Fallen Order, that's it, yeah. It's like $8 at the moment, and I'm just
it's not. It's $8
Yeah,
right
it is.
now. Oh,
Yeah,
buddy. I'm buying that. Holy shit. Okay, we got to get out of here so I can go. I got to go buy some video games and watch Stranger Things 4 Part 2. Okay, so we're gonna call it a day here. Otherwise, we'll just be jawing all day. So thank you guys again. Appreciate it. Make sure you write in for next week's show. If you want to show your support, remember to head over to the Patreon, patreon.com/FlipScreenGames. If you want to find links to all the places that you can find us all over the web, regardless, however you want to show your support, however you want to get involved, FlipScreen.games. That's our website where you can find us all over the web. Go check out our sister shows. Go check out our Twitch streams. Just come be a part of what we're doing. We love you. Thank you for being a part of it. Thanks for tuning in. And we'll catch you next week. I've been Pete. He's been Steve for Flip Screen Games Podcast. We'll see you next week. I got there.